You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
I very much enjoyed the most recent lectures after our discussion by Jamie and Michaela and Kristen because it reflects, I think, very well on the diversity and kind of questions that our whole research group is doing. And in many ways, this last talk is actually trying to interact between our own internal research program that we engage in and our educational mission and the way that we think about that and how we're sort of opening up to this. So one way to think about it is actually something that Kristen said at the very end of her talk, which was about liberalism. So one of the things that unites us, we're a PPE group, right? So philosophy, politics, and economics. We have a weekly seminar. I'm going to talk about some of this stuff in a minute. But in fact, I hope many of you eventually will be people we invite to come give seminars in our group. But we try to divide it up where we have 5 economists, 5 political scientists, 5 philosophers every once in a while. And so some of our products of our program, for example, if you're a philosophy major at Arizona or studying philosophy at Arizona, Vlad Tarko, who is was the department chair of moral science. He's Paul and mine's PhD student. If you're up at Brown at all and you have in political science, David Skarbek, he's also my PhD student. If you're down at Texas Tech, the whole group there, political scientists and economists. But our base is in economics. So it makes us very weird. Viviana Zelizer, who's at Princeton, economic sociologist, we actually have a specialty within our PhD program in economics and economic sociology. And what Viviana says is, to her knowledge, that is the only one in the entire world, right, that's doing that. And so going back to the question that was raised about the global south and the discrepancies there, you're talking to a group of economists who at their core all believe that we have to interact with political, legal, and social, that the economies are embedded with always a political, legal, and social ecology. And in particular, we study a lot of the social ecology. So the informal rules and the informal, in my own case, my background was in Sovietology, and one of the things that I focused a lot on in my work was on the illicit markets. So, what's going on in those various things, both in the formal sector, which was the illicit engagements to make the system actually operate within the bureaucracy, let alone outside of the bureaucracy and whatnot. I mean, one of the mysteries of Soviet life was that you basically had a planned sector, right? And then a shirking within the planned sector, and then a black market sector, all right? And so what you did, because there's a fantastic book on this, on dictatorship over our needs, what they did was you would often, because there was no alternative supply chains, right? So they would steal from the state, and then, so an old Soviet joke was a state shortage of buns and a state shortage of sausage is a sandwich sold out the back window, okay? And by the way, that's another thing that I might not get a chance to talk about here, but in the kind of inquiry that we're engaged in, we want to understand the human condition, right? And so therefore, one of the things that's very important to understanding the human condition is humor, right? And one of the things is to learn, and this would be a great research topic, is to study the jokes, not jokes others tell about you, but jokes you tell about yourself. And what does that say about the society that you live in? Right? And, so again, think about it. You can't put that in a reduced form and then, run regressions on that, right? That requires what? That you have to actually engage in ethnographic research, all right? And so this is going to be a big question about my invitation inquiry. But before I get ahead of myself, which I already have, let me sort of just start with this idea about the nature of the Republic of Science and what we're trying to do here. So let me go to the first slide. So here's my appeal to you. All right. So all of us here, PhD students, we're the weird ones. When I first started teaching, by the way, I was devastated that not every student wanted to go get a PhD in economics. I was a second-year graduate student. I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. And my best friend was a guy named Dave Perchico, and he was also teaching at the time. And I was like, Dave, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he goes, Pete, you haven't figured out we're the weird ones. And I'm like, what do you mean we're the weird ones? He says, when you were an undergraduate and you got really into economics, oh yeah, I loved it. I had a great, whole experience, Saul on the road to Damascus type thing. And then he says to me, how about your classmates? Oh yeah, they fell asleep in the class. They didn't give a crap, like that. They only worried about maybe, is this going to be on the test or whatever? They never did any extra reading. He goes, right. You were the weird one, right? So rather than they're the weird ones, we're the weird ones, right? So again, I'm sure that you guys have all experienced this. One of the things that when I used to run into Dave afterwards in grad school, we used to say the following thing: what book has kept you up at night kept you up all night? What have you read recently that kept you up all night, right? Rather than the idea that, I just work on my scholarship 9 to 5, So we were talking about work-life balance at one time. I turned to my wife and I said, what do you think about work-life balance? By the way, I had a book in my lap while we were watching PBS, and she looked at me and she said, what do you mean? When do you not work? And I'm like, well, this isn't really work. I'm just enjoying, reading. And she goes, we're supposed to be watching TV. She also gets pissed off at me because I fact check, right? So I watch historical things with her on TV, and I'm like, let me check and see if that's what's really going on. And then I tell her, and she goes, I don't really give a shit. It's a, it's a good story. And I'm trying to correct the crown or whatever, right? Anyway, so we here, right, we value scientific search for truth and scholarship, right? The engagement of scholarship. On the other hand, we also believe that ideas associated with spontaneous order and democratic self-governance are byproducts of that quest for scientific truth, right? So they're not prior commitments, they're byproducts. I believe, that's probably the weird thing why many of us are economists, is because, when you learn economics and you do this, remember Adam Smith, let's step back. Adam Smith argued that our science progresses by what, right? A sense of awe, right? Or, right, wonderment, all right? And then what we have is surprise, and then appreciation, right? So think about the big quote that Kristen put up in the beginning about the anonymity, right? Scarce in our lifetime do we have the opportunity to make but a few friends. But for our survival, we require the great multitude of people for us to be able to coordinate with one another, right? When you see that, right, and you allow yourself to be surprised by wonder about the mystery of the mundane, you're like, how the hell did that happen? So what would your normal intuition tell you how it happened? Got to have a boss, right? Got to have a boss, right? And so when you find out that there's not a boss that's operating, in fact, all these individuals have no knowledge of one another, no one has any knowledge of the whole process, right? No one can make a pencil, no one can make a common woolen coat because of all the division of labor and the specialties and everything involved. Now what you do is you move from wonderment to what? Surprise. Oh my God, that's how it works? Because I've just unleashed the governing dynamics. Once you understand the governing dynamics in their operation, you then have an appreciation for them. So this is what Smith was trying to get us to think about in the progression of our scientific thought. So again, our various different wonderment, surprise, and appreciation, those are things that have come upon us. Those are the human curiosity that hits us, all right? The answer to those is not our priors, right? It's not the prior, it's a byproduct. So if the case is that this is a byproduct of this quest to understand the world, and since we believe these ideas are valuable and intellectual relevance for the good society, but not everyone agrees, right? Right? There's all kinds of disagreement about it, and we have to recognize that. Then our mission, right, is to somehow get people to go through that stage of wonderment, surprise, and appreciation within the social sciences. So it's like, trying to get people to see the scientific value of invisible hand mechanisms that are in operation. Not necessarily, so invisible hand has a variety of different things going on. Like Smith scholars sometimes get preoccupied with space in the book rather than thrust of an argument. So we'll say, oh, Smith only uses the term invisible hand like once or twice. Like, why the hell is that all important? You guys are all bullshit, talking about the invisible hand. Visible hand is about reasoning. It's a style of reasoning. And in that style of reasoning exists from A to Z in Smith. It permeates the entire text. And so, you have to actually sort of not just focus on the words, right? You have to focus on the style of reasoning and what he's trying to argue and different examples in which he's using the same style of reasoning to explain a variety of differences in outcomes. And so I think this is what we're trying to get out there and get across. And its relationship to the good society is actually, related to liberalism. But as Kristen said at the end, liberalism is not a fixed in doctrine. So one, it's never been fixed, all right? It's never been, that's the liberal position, right? It's a variety of positions in which we have discourse. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't some general principles, right, that go along. You can think about things like the rule of law, freedom of contract, private property, all these things. They're all part of the liberal project. Constitutions that constrain the unchecked authority of the state and all of these things. Here's the biggest thing about liberalism that I would want to stress to you, and it relates to Michaela's talk as well as others, Jamie's talk in particular, all right? And that is liberalism has always been an emancipatory project. It was born in the overcoming of the religious wars. So that's number one, right? We're going to get beyond the religious wars. My colleague, Paul Alagica, is working a lot on this idea of the modus vivendi, kind of norm, right? Coming back in, which is one of the core ideas that was associated with overcoming the religious wars. But liberalism was an emancipatory project from the dogma of the altar, right? That's what we're going to first overcome. The second thing is that liberalism has always been anti-militaristic, all right? So it's trying to overcome the violence of the sword. It's always been anti-slavery. It's trying to overcome the bondage of slavery, emancipate it. All the great classical economists were anti-slavery. This in my group, I tried to talk about this great book that all of you should look up. It's called How the Dismal Science Got Its Name, because we misunderstand that whole debate about what was going on. But Smith to Mill, these are all anti-slavery people at a time when slavery was a norm. By the way, who were the ones that were in favor of slavery and in favor of the natural hierarchy of man? Thomas Carlyle. Now I'm going to say a name that will really freak you out. Charles Dickens. Okay? These are the people, and they hated economics. Dickens devotes an entire book, right, on hard times. It's about the Industrial Revolution. All right? And part of the reason why they don't like economics, why economics is the dismal science, isn't because of Malthusianism. It's precisely because economics is telling you that we are natural equals. So again, go back to Smith. What's the passage in Smith, right? The street porter and the philosopher, right? The only difference between the street porter and the philosopher is in the mind of who? The philosopher, right? And so they're analytical egalitarians. And the other people thought that they believed in tradition and the natural hierarchy of things and the classes and all these things like that. And this was all being torn asunder by the economists. And so they're like, oh my God, that's terrible. They're dismal, right? We're going to have this other sort of idea. So liberalism was never a complete doctrine, but it is an emancipatory project. It's constantly coming up and challenging new kinds of oppressions. Okay, so not only do you have the oppression from the church at the altar, from the sword, from slavery, but also how about miserable poverty? This is what the Wealth of Nations is about. How is it not? How can I make the rich richer? Right? It's how it is that I can lift the most vulnerable and least advantaged up. not from a boss, but through the social forces. All right? And so that's what the inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. If it was a boss, mercantilism would have been the way to deliver. But what did mercantilism do? Mercantilism gave special privileges. So then again, that's the next one. Smith is anti-mercantilist interest, right? He wrote a letter after he wrote The Wealth of Nations, someone describing his book as a full-on assault of all of British commercial life. We read that today and we think, oh man, maybe he's critical of capitalism. No, because what British commercial life was at the time he's writing is mercantilist. Monopoly privileges granted by the king to various different interest groups. All right, and so we want to overcome the mercantilist privilege. All right, so that's another one that we're trying to eliminate that. So think in terms of that, and you'll see like the kind of project, the way liberalism has evolved over the years. And so continuing, there's both oppression and then there is deliverance. And liberalism begins with a very strong recognition of the oppression, but then a promise of the deliverance. All right? And so it's that's the issue there. Now, what's the real problem with this? Well, our problems change every 20 years, right? We have new tools of oppression, new tools of special privilege that are granted. And so what Hayek tells us in the very beginning of the Constitution of Liberty, if the old truths are to retain their holds on men's minds, by the way, he would rewrite that as a different sentence today, right? So if the old truths are to retain their hold, they must be restated in the language and concepts of successive generations. What at one time are their most effective expressions gradually become so worn with use that they cease to carry a definitive meaning. The underlying ideas may be valid as ever, but the words, even when they refer to problems that are still with us, no longer convey the same conviction. So not only do we have to have a constantly evolving discourse about, what is this issue of oppression and deliverance, but we also have to have a worry of our rhetoric and our way we talk to one another and the way we communicate, because we want to be heard, right? Right? And so we want to have that argument come across. So you have to, really embrace the issue of language. When I talk to PhD students and they're trying to get ready to write their dissertations, like a lot of social science is word salad, right? Or statistical salad. It doesn't matter, right? It's like when people run regressions or whatever, it doesn't mean that they have clarity. Sometimes they have absolutely no clarity. They're just running shit and press an F9 key and they have no understanding. I want them to do it. So one of the things I try to always stress to my students is, first and foremost, this isn't to deny the subtleties and nuance of the world. I say, first and foremost, what you need to do is develop a linear argument. Like, tell me what your linear argument is. Okay, now, second, make sure that you are clear in your thinking and clear in your exposition. All right, now, for all of you who are going to teach, again, this is going to sound like boring at some level, but the best advice you'll ever get is really old advice, which is you tell people what you're going to say it, and then you tell them what you said. All right? Now, that's true for the journal articles you write as well. It's not haiku, right? You're not just sitting down like, let me just go to town, because when I was in fifth grade, they told me that made me creative. No, right? Clarity, right? Like that. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be rhetorically flourish or whatever. Of course you should. You have some poetry to your life or whatever, but and you like turns of phrases, but the main thing is clarity. You want people to walk away. There's not a single time that you could read anything from Chris Coyne or listen to him give a talk where you end up afterwards saying, WTF, what was he talking about? Right? You might not like what he has to say, but you know what it is he had to say. Every single time. He never misses the boat. And so that's clarity, right, across the board. Okay, so this is what we have to address. We have to constantly adapt our ideas and the way we express those ideas to make sure that we communicate with the people that we are talking to, our discourse community. By the way, I don't know if you guys have let this be self-reflective on this, but the pandemic was great for us, academics, right? Why? Because we're really the most social introverts in the world. You can't be an academic unless you're an introvert, because you have to spend hours and hours and hours by yourself. All your energy is from yourself, because you read books, you do things like that. You don't, like this. So I was elated. I didn't have to see people. The only person I saw was my wife, and I had this huge library. I have like 10,000 volumes in my library. So I could have conversations with all my friends. They're just my books, right? And so, I had a problem with my fireplace during the pandemic, and so they had to send some people over. It's a gas thing, so it was like a major issue that they had to come and fix. And the guy says to me, he says, "Do you have to commute at all?" I go, "Yep, here's my commute." I start there in that bedroom here. I go down the stairs. I go into that office there. If I'm really ambitious, I go all the way to the basement. I'm hanging out with my books. And the guy looked at me. He says, "What the hell is like going?" I go, "That's my commute, right? That's it." And then, now some of this stuff is weird because when you talk, right? Like I normally like to walk around and do all that stuff. I can't do that now, but I like to kind of interact with you. Try to do that when you're on Zoom. My wife busted up because she'd say like, "Pete, you don't have to scream at them," because I thought they were so far away because they're, so I was like, "You can't hear me," so I'm like screaming into that. So the other thing that was funny is that, so Hamilton has the story at the end of Hamilton, the song, "Who's going to tell your story?" And I was teaching a history of ideas course. And so I put the song on, and my wife thinks I listen to Hamilton soundtrack too much anyway. So anyway, I had it on, I had it blasted or whatever, and she comes in, the Zoom is all on, the students are all there, but I'm playing that to begin with, and she comes in, she goes, "What the hell are you doing again? Like, would you please turn that damn thing down?" I'm like, "They're on the class." She goes, "Ah!" Yeah. So anyway, but it's not that the pandemic, it's not like we're misanthropes. It's not like, oh, people are miserable, therefore I'm happy. It's actually just that we were able to be built for it. That's what my colleague Dick Wagner used to say. We're built for this. So, because we spend so much of our time, trying to do this, but when we have these conversations in the past, we're not just trying to do a mind hop to the past. We're actually trying to mine the past for addressing the conversations today and to learn the evolution. That's an evolution of arguments. What happened that was adjacent, possible, the next evolutionary step in ideas. That's why you want to study the history of ideas in the long march. All right. Rule 1. The worst thing that can happen to a good cause is not to be artfully criticized, but to be ineptly defended. All right, so try to remember that, right? So one of the things that we want to do is we want to actually invite criticisms, not run away from criticisms, right? We don't want to, shut criticisms down. You want to actually listen to them, hear them there's listening and there's hearing, right? You want to, really hear them and absorb them and be able to address them to try to do what? Because that's related to the Hayek task. The kind of criticisms that you're going to get evolve just like the kind of doctrines that you're going to offer. So it's this question and answer. Kristen mentioned Gadamer. I didn't know actually that about her and Gadamer. This is ironic because Gadamer's older than dirt, but I actually saw Gadamer give a talk. It's one of the most memorable talks I've ever seen in my life. It was on the power of the spoken word. And as a graduate student, I actually had to read Truth and Method and like in and out, plus also all of his other books. And I was very involved with that because my teacher, Don Lavoie, was really into Habermas and building these ideas. But one of the things that was really that changed me is that economics is taught as an engineering science. So what you have is problems and solutions. What Gadamer gets you to understand is that it's about questions and answers that are constantly going back and forth. And once I adopted that idea that this wasn't an idea that I have a single exit that I'm looking for, right? A definitive answer. When I want to build a tight model, parsimonious, and then have a single exit, right? Then all of a sudden it became, well, maybe that problem solution approach to social science isn't the way that I would make progress. But instead, maybe it's this questioning and answering. It's dialogue, right? We have to, engage in dialogue. And maybe that might be one of the defining differences here. All right, as a social scientist. So just remember that. Don't ever be afraid of an artful criticism, but definitely try not to be inept. All right, so this is my favorite philosopher of science. His name is Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi was a physical chemist. He actually worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute along with Einstein, and he was the person in charge of physical chemistry. It was actually rumored that he was supposed to have won the Nobel Prize. He didn't end up by winning the Nobel Prize. This was for his own theories in chemistry. His son, ironically, did win the Nobel Prize in chemistry the same year that Jim Buchanan won the award in economics. But, Polanyi spent a lot of time after the totalitarian experiences of the 1930s and 40s. Polanyi was drawn into trying to examine what is the nature of science, because the nature of science, in his mind, was a foundation of a free society. And he lost a lot of friends. He's Austro-Hungarian, by birth Hungarian, who was raised in Vienna, and he lost friends behind the Iron Curtain. He lost friends because of Nazi Germany. He was forced out of the Kaiser Wilhelm, right, because of the rise of the Nazis, but then he also lost friends behind the Iron Curtain and the nature of science there. And so he started thinking, like, what makes science actually this free inquiry? This is a really old video reference, but do any of you here know or ever seen the series on PBS called The Ascent of Man by Jacob Bernowski? If not, just write a little note to yourself. Go to YouTube, not now, because then you won't pay attention to me, but go to YouTube afterwards and just look up The Ascent of Man and Holocaust, because there's a fantastic scene in which Jacob Bernowski returns to Auschwitz and addresses the reasons why science was the bulwark against that kind of outcome, and yet, how it failed, right, in terms of the quest for ultimate certainty and dogma and all these things like that. And so he explains the nature of science and stuff. That's kind of what Polanyi was doing. Science in a free society. How do I understand this? And then, as he was studying, now here's a key thing. He thought he should have won a Nobel Prize. His friends all thought he should have won a Nobel Prize, but he didn't win the Nobel Prize. So what happens when something like that happens to you? You could become bitter, right? Or what you could do is try to understand why my ideas didn't get across. I can look in the mirror and say, like, what is it that I was doing wrong? And so he tries to explain what it takes to make a contribution in science. And what it takes to make a contribution in the Republic of Science is, first off, your explanation has to be plausible to the scientific community. That's the first one. You can't be viewed as a quack, right? Because what's the worst thing that can happen in science is to allow science to be invaded by quackery. So what we have to do is we got to find ways, guardrails, right? So the first thing is plausibility. Second thing, interesting. It's of intrinsic interest to other social scientists or other physical scientists, right? It's like, yeah, that's an interesting problem to solve, right? Not, what are you talking about? Like, I don't care. It's like, that's minuscule, right? So it has to be that. And then finally, it has to be creative. Now, note what's going on here, right, is that you have conservative forces in science and revolutionary forces in science. Thomas Kuhn later on called that the essential tension of science. And that's what Polanyi was trying to get at. Science in a free society has to have these guardrails against quackery, but encourage novelty and creativity. All right? And so we've been talking about institutions a lot in here. Here's the big problem with institutions. They can't be rigid and they can't be completely flexible. So they have to have both coherence and flexibility. Otherwise, you're going to break against the rigidity of them, or they're going to be like on a word processor. Like, who cares? It has no meaning for me here, right? Because I can just change it like this. So if it's just constantly changing, it doesn't serve its purpose. If it never, ever changes, it doesn't serve its purpose. But so how do you find that balance? By the way, a lot of social science is most fascinating when you jump into the idea of tensions, anomalies, and paradoxes. And it's not so interesting when it's basically smooth and continuous and twice differentiable. Right? That gives us demonstrative reasons, not necessarily plausible reasons. But it doesn't, that demonstrative reasoning, as I said the other night, might close out the humanity because it's expecting us to have something about humanity which we maybe can't deliver. So this is a key thing. You gotta, and this is like Kristen mentioned about your disciplines and all these things like that. Yes, you have to know what's going on in your discipline, right? You can't be the arrogance of the eccentric, right? Which is like, hey, I'm just thinking all by myself and I'm here in my basement, because you're a social introvert and you're like, I don't care what anyone else says, right? That doesn't work. But on the other hand, you don't really make much advance if you just do what everyone else is doing. I'm going to conform to whatever the mainstream is just because, my teachers told me that. Why would you do it that way? Because my teachers told me that. That's not a scientific answer, is it? That's a dogmatic answer, right? So you got to steer this path between the comfortable conformist and the arrogant eccentric. Again, tensions, anomalies, paradoxes. What's the key thing? Paul Samuelson, I'm invoking one of the conformists. But anyway, but he was the one who dictated the conformism. So that's always a good position to be in. It's like Mel Brooks in The Meaning of the World, The History of the World, where he says it's good to be the king. If you don't know that, look that up on YouTube too. It's very funny, though very inappropriate. But he says the only thing that we work for is the applause of our peers. That's the only thing we work for, right? Well, that's citations, right? But here's the big thing. Scientific success is a function of whether or not you are perceived to be a productive input into others' production process. All right? So if you have great wisdom and great insight, but you're not useful as an input, you're going to have a scientific ceiling. The ones who take off are the ones who are viewed as useful inputs into other scientific process. Right? There's a fantastic book called Conversations with Economists, and it's a series of interviews, and it was trying to discuss in the mid-1980s the revolution transformation of economics towards what was called new classical macroeconomics. So the old Keynesian system had run its course, and now there was this new thing, and Bob Lucas was the architect of that. And Ario Klammer's interviewing him, and Lucas says, in the mid-1970s, I knew I was on a revolution because every time I gave a paper, 5 graduate students would come follow me afterwards telling me what dissertation they wanted to write following up on my papers. Okay? So that's how science actually happens. People listen to you and they're like, oh my God, I want to work on that. Right? I'm going to do that. There's a great example of this, which is in the most recent movie, Oppenheimer, which is based on a pretty cool book, American Prometheus. But the movie is kind of intriguing, but it doesn't go into the details. But there's a great scene when Oppenheimer first starts teaching at Berkeley. He's teaching a course on theoretical physics. There's only one student that signs up. And then what they do is they show over time how it goes from 1 student to 5 students, 5 students to 10 students, 10 students to 20 students, 20 students to 50 students, all like that. All right? And so just think about that. That's actually having an impact. Why? Because the people hear what you're saying and it's like, okay, I can work on that. I can do something with that. Let me go in there, right? And that's the kind of idea that Polanyi is trying to get us to think about. So we have these guardrails, and then we have this process. And what we have to do is we have to be part of the community of science that is challenging the status quo, all right? But not challenging the status quo in such a way that the status quo can completely ignore you. One last book on philosophy of science, but this is more of a history and sociology of science and philosophy. This is a book by Randall Collins. I really highly recommend it. It's called The Sociology of Philosophies. And what he asks is, what are the practices that are productive for us to spread ideas in intellectual affairs? And what are the practices that are counterproductive? All right? And so here's one of the main ones, is that those schools of intellectual thought that are usually identified with an individual and the personality of the individual, they tend to have an expiration date. But those that are around an idea, centrality of an idea, they have constant evolutionary potential. And so you have to, think in those terms. So, given what I just said, I've been involved in this game now for 40 years. And so that doesn't mean that I know what I'm talking about, but it means that I have some impressions about what I've learned over that time. And I'm going to try to share some of them with you. So the first thing is what I think are individual behavior of academics. And I think that we have to remember that academics is not a hobby. This is a profession. It's a craft, and you should work constantly to improve your craftsmanship. Okay? So the number one thing is be a great teacher. You're not going to hear that maybe from a lot of people, but I think that's our number one role. Our pedagogical responsibilities are probably our most. You're trying to communicate to students, and so you have to remember to begin where they are, not where you are. All right? Now, I have a hard time with this because all my cultural references are really old now, right? Even like when I try to say jokes or whatever, and I'm like, so just to give you an example of this, because of my silly condition, but you should see me in a pool. I'm actually really quite mobile in a pool. Can do all kinds of things, like that, and it's very exciting. So I gave a talk at the University of Tennessee a year ago, and it was at the business school, but it was an evening talk to the business community. There's a lot of old people, older than me or my age or whatever. And I had to move from, I still at that time was walking around. I wasn't on a walker, I was on a cane. But I could walk around and do everything. But then after a while, I had to sit down. So I said to everyone, I apologize, I have to sit down because I have this bad hip and everything like that. And then I said, but you should see me in the pool. I'm like the incredible Mr. Limpet. They busted out laughing. None of you even know what that is, right? And it's a movie from when I was a kid in which this character who is not allowed to join the army in World War II because he's infirm and everything like that, he wishes he was a fish. He becomes a fish, and then he's like the super war hero, right? He's like, like Mr. America or whatever. They all laughed, right? I told my wife this when I came home. I said, it was hilarious. They were all laughing. She goes, you cannot use that reference. She went with me on a trip. I went back to my alma mater to give a talk. And right before my talk, she says, do not use that Mr. Limpet thing. No one will understand. I'm like, but it's such a good thing. She goes, they won't understand it, so it won't be. So anyway, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I mentioned the other day, you kind of knew that, right? But, even there, that's kind of getting old now or whatever. And you probably certainly don't know the original movie, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which also, has Pee Wee Herman has a great line in there where he says he can do anything. And Buffy says back to him, because he cut off his arm, and she says, yeah, clap. Right? And you don't have that. So you have to find the kids where they are. What an 18-year-old today is concerned about. What they care about, what they think about, that's where you start. If you want to do social science, right, and you're trying to get them interested in the power of the logic of the arguments that you're giving, it has to resonate with them. All right? So that's one. Be a great teacher. It's probably the most important job you'll ever have because, your writing might get 2 or 3 people reading it, right? But in front of students, you can reach and be transformative. Try to be a life-changing professor, right? The kind of professor that most of you probably had. And by the way, this is very simple to do. Remember the professors that you enjoyed and remember the ones you hated. Don't be the one you hated, okay? So I coached basketball at various levels for a very long time, up from middle school to a national team. And one of the things I used to try to tell the kids, especially the kids that were really good, was I'd say, do you know who you hate when someone's guarding you? Right? Like you just hate them. They're like horrible. They bug the hell out of you. Be that guy. Right? You know the guy that you hate to guard? Right? Like when you're playing defense and the guy's constantly moving, setting picks, moving like that. I said, you hate that guy because you're constantly working? I said, be that guy, right? It's the same thing with teaching. You've experienced, you guys are professional students, right? So what is a good teacher and what's a bad teacher. It's a conscious choice by you to be a bad teacher. You're like, nah, I don't give a crap. I'll just shirk the hell out of this, right? And by the way, you rightfully can, because all the incentives are lined up for you to do so. Because when you go to the university, even at a lot of teaching schools, especially in economics, they're like, what's your publications like, right? And you're like, okay, I got these publications. Like, look, you need to have, 6 publications in 6 years in this ranked journal. And unless you have that, it's like, you look at the older faculty, I'm like, well, dude, when were you in those journals? Like, never? Okay, so what the hell are you doing, Right? So all the incentives are lined up to be different than this. I'm trying to tell you to fight differently than that. Second line, be a great citizen. Again, sounds counterintuitive. But what it means is that you care about the environment within which you work. You're building all of that up. So don't run away from actually doing service. And then finally, be a consistent and persistent researcher. Be thorough and active. Don't ever stop, right? So that, your work can be seen as a productive input into the research process of others. If you do those 3 things, you'll have a great career. I don't care if you're in a field that doesn't hire people or in a field that hires a lot. Okay? You'll be able to have a great career. You'll find a way there. Okay? People will find you. All right, so why do I say that these individual behaviors are so important? Because when we study the organization of inquiry, it's actually activating those 3 behaviors within this kind of ecology that leads to significant paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts never happen from the brow of a genius, right? They never walk alone. All right, the paradigm shifts are not walking alone, people, because they need a network, right? There's a huge network effect that's required to be able to do this. So one of the first things we recognize is that in all of these cases, they have centers of learning. Now, those centers of learning can be entire departments. That's what happened at MIT. When Samuelson went to MIT after he got his PhD in the late 40s, he was the first major economics teacher there. He only went there because there was discrimination against Jewish academics. All right? And so they created it. It was all engineers. In fact, economics, his textbook, was a project by the president of the university to tell Samuelson, write a book so that our engineering students can study economics. And so that's how he wrote it. But what did he do over the next decade? He ended up by actually building an entire department. For those in your political science, Bill Riker did this at University of Rochester. Before Riker moved to Rochester, Rochester didn't have a PhD program. All right, and someone mentioned about the rational, like Chris's thing and the different stuff about public choice. In the field of political science, this is, public choice, a variant of public choice is basically rational choice political science. Okay, rational choice theory associated with people from Ken Shepsley, Barry Weingast, all the way down to Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and a bunch of other ones, right? But it all founds its source in Riker. And about 2 decades ago, there was a big debate in political science called the Perestroika debate. And people fought all over whether or not you're going to do, institutions or you're doing rational choice or whatever. Okay, so you can look that up. It's old gone now because, the debate's been settled or whatever. But, what Riker did was he moved from a Lawrence University in Wisconsin, which was not a graduate program, it was an undergraduate program. And he got the chance to go to build a new political science department at Rochester. And he built that department up into being one of the most formidable departments in all of political science. Right? So he had a department. Samuelson had a department. Other people have centers. The Ostroms had a center. All right? So when they went to Indiana, the political science people they were a little suspicious about them. So they had to build their own little universe within the political science department, okay? And they called it a workshop, which, by the way, the terms mean something. The reason why it's called a workshop has to do with the idea of the craftsmanship and the artisanship that's involved in scholarship. So they actually involved students in their work right from the beginning. So one of Eleanor Ostrom's very first students is Jane Pauley. Do you know who Jane Pauley is? You guys are too young, so none of you get up very early on Sunday, so you don't watch Sunday Morning. She's the host of Sunday Morning, okay? She went on to have a fantastic career in journalism and whatnot, but she did that. Barbara Allen, who is, one of the devotees of the workshop, she was brought in as an undergrad. They kind of adopted her as a daughter, basically. But she was first an undergraduate, then a graduate student, worked with Vincent and Lynn all the way through. So they built this workshop kind of idea. So centers of learning, universities, and research centers, those are crucial to the advancement of scientific progress. The second thing that's common is dedicated workshops. That is that they have a workshop in which all the scholars get together and are willing to discuss new ideas and debate ways to improve each other's work, okay? Then finally, you have to have research outlets. If you don't have the outlets, then, it just is like, what are you doing? It's like, again, down in your basement, like, isn't Adam Smith cool? No, right, no one's listening to me down there, right? So you have to have these. What do those come in the form of? Journals and books, okay? So just in my own case, for example, I because of the examples I had when I was coming up, I've spent my entire professional career as both a scholar and as an editor. So I've edited journals. I edit journals all the way through, even to this day. I'm still involved in the editing of journals. I'm also an editor at book series. So I run 2 book series at Cambridge. All right, one little short monographs one much bigger one. So think about that, by the way. We're always looking for manuscripts that we can reject so we get our rejection rate up. So I'm only kidding. I also edit a series for Edward Elgar as well, which is a little different. So, you have to think about how you fit into these networks and build these organization of inquiry. I'll give you, I think the key thing is to find that network for you which insists on lifelong learning, right? So that you know things different 10 years from now than you know today, and 20 years, you know even more things rather than just stagnant. So one of the most impressive people of minds that you can meet are people that are lifelong learners. Rather than, right, there's 2 different types of people, right? There's the old, Berlin's hedgehog and fox thing. But there's another way to think about that hedgehog and fox thing besides the big theory or the little like gathering of the facts, is that you have somebody who, I have my big idea, and then I stay with that big idea my whole life. Or I keep on having evolving big ideas. All right, and you kind of move from various different places and you do things like that. So you want to find yourself in a community of lifelong learners. In my case, for example, that lifelong learning outside of the university was conducted by groups like FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, the Institute for Humane Studies, and then Liberty Fund, right? And it was very simple. FEE was for undergraduates, IHS was for graduate students, Liberty Fund was for adults, right? And so I can remember when I first got invited to a Liberty Fund conference, I thought like, oh my God, like I made it, kind of thing, because now I was able to do those things. For example, I still do a lot of things with Liberty Fund, and besides this project, and Liberty Fund is all built on the idea of a contested conversation, right, about the concept of liberty. It's not, again, settled doctrine. It's actually a constant conversation. That's what they're trying to do, cultivate the conversation over the concept of liberty. But in that light, I actually run like an Oprah book club thing. It's called No Due Date. It's open to anyone, so you should look it up and subscribe. You get a book each month, and then we get a reading, and we do discussions, and then if it's a live person, I interview the author. If it's a person that's already passed away or is not available, then we interview someone who is an expert in like their work or whatever. And what I do is it's a very short interview by me, and then it's Q&A by all the people that are a part of the subscribers club. But Amy Willis isn't here anymore, but if you email her or know her or whatever, and you're interested. So that's why, someone was asking me about this the other day. That's why we're reading The Master and the Margarita. That's the book club for this month, actually, July. All right, so what is it that we've been talking about here as what this research community has tried to evolve and develop, what we call the, why the Bloomington, Virginia, Austrian combination, right? And I want to suggest that in the way we think about this is that there's a common analytical focus, which allows us to have a common language by which we can talk to one another. All right, now I'm going to argue that common focus, analytical focus, is that we focus on exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. Now, the other way to translate that in the language that might make more sense to people outside of economics is relations before transactions. Relations before transactions. So you have to recognize that all of social life is embedded within political, legal, and social context. And that if we don't pay attention to that context, we are not going to understand how it is that people see their relationships with one another and the opportunities that they see. Okay? So one of the things, go back to my earlier point, you have oppression, you have deliverance. One of the people like me who are really into economics, okay, one of the things that we like to focus on, we might have our blind spots, okay, but also one of the things that is really focused in our work is the power that markets have to deliver the least advantaged out of their miserable existence. The power of entrepreneurship, the power of innovation, all right? The idea that innovation is the child of freedom, but the parent of prosperity. And again, just do the thought experiment about where you would like to lie in history or in various geographic regions if you find yourself actually behind a veil of ignorance coming out and when in front of the veil of ignorance is one of the disadvantaged. Do you want to be in a society in which power and privilege is concentrated, or do you want to be in an idea where power and privilege is constantly contested? Okay, and which one do you go from there? Now, by the way, that's an argument I have to establish, not an argument that's pre-established for me in conversation with all of you, right? But note what has to happen here. You have to have the recognition of what the problem is, and then the opportunity of the deliverance from that problem. And so this is, again, what Adam Smith was talking about, right? What is that deliverance of the increased, what? Productive capacity of mankind. Because again, a simple economic point, you can't increase real income without increasing real productivity. The problem to solving the problem that started ever since the fall, right? And we end up out of the garden, right? Is what? Right? We have to actually increase our productive capacity. I can't fix it by giving you money. That doesn't fix the problem. But being able to actually increase your productivity, that's going to fix the problem. Now, how do you increase your productivity, right? That's going to be through what? Either development of human capital, the advancement of physical capital, and the rules under which human capital and physical capital interact. Okay? And so that's about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. The second point is these are thinkers that focused on social change. We heard about social movements. We heard about, the evolution of rights, right? But it's also the case that entrepreneurship in the private and public arena, that's the focus of change. If you're going to study social change, you need to have an agent of change. And that agent of change is not mythical forces, it's entrepreneurial alertness. Recognition of the opportunities to change things. So dissenters, right? But go back again to the science thing. Dissenters within what? The guardrails of a tradition. Not because we like tradition, but because that's where you begin with. You can't imagine a start state. You begin in the here and now, and then you have to change from the here and now, and that requires these change agents. And then the third thing is the epistemic turn. These thinkers that we focus on tend to focus not on ideal efficiency, but adaptive efficiency and the role of feedback and learning mechanisms under alternative institutional environments. That's what Paul Alagica was talking about, right? It's this adaptation. We have to constantly adapt and adjust. We're constantly, economic actors, social actors, political actors are bobbing and weaving, right? Constantly adapting, adjusting, all right? Not just being stasis, all right? And what is it that determines it? It's not just incentives. There's a lot of incentive institutionalism, and I'm not denying that, right? That's a powerful thing, all right? But there's also epistemic institutionalism, which is how is it that these alternative institutional environments affect the learning environment within which you operate. To use the metaphor from teaching, right? Part of what we all do in teaching is trying to figure out pedagogically what are actually conducive environments for learning, right? And so what we want to do is we want to increase that ecology for learning, right? So that our students retain. One of my favorite books is actually a book about a basketball coach at UCLA, John Wooden. It's called That You Haven't Taught Until They've Learned. And one of the things that psychology researchers did when John Wooden was at his peak of his great basketball things was they studied John Wooden compared to a normal professor in class, because Wooden always described himself as a teacher, and what his graduates would retain from his lectures. Sad news is, most students don't really retain what we talk to them about, but John Wooden had something like a 90% retention rate. You could go up to any player that had played for him in the 20-year period and go up to him and say, what do you remember about what Coach Wooden taught you? And they could like rattle it off like this. All right, and Wooden got his coaching philosophy from being a high school English teacher. That's how he started his life, right? As a high school English teacher. And that's what he always said. He goes, I'm a teacher. That's my job. I'm a teacher. And it was, you haven't taught until they've learned. It's a very important idea, I think. So what happens with all this stuff? I'm not going to belabor this argumentative structure thing. Part of the reason is that that some of my colleagues might disagree with some of this aspect of this, but to me, this is the defining characteristic of mainline economics that contrasts it with mainstream economics or political economy. And that is that, you know, in the main line, what individuals do is they derive the invisible hand proposition from the self-interest postulate via institutions. So they don't collapse. So the focus of our analytical attention, going back, is on those institutions within which those economic relationships are formed and transactions take place. So again, relations before transactions. So you got to explain that first. So again, Adam Smith didn't say individuals pursuing their self-interest in any conceivable institutional environment will generate a publicly desirable outcome. Self-interest isn't the explanatory power there. What the explanatory power is the different alternative institutions. At least that's the way I would argue that. And that's through the history of mainline economics, is that kind of playing out that. So again, the focus is on institutions. But there is, as Paul mentioned, also this normative implication. And this was raised a little bit yesterday in one of the questions. And I just want to reiterate something. The definition of a free society is not, in the writings of these people, okay, is not a libertarian haven. All right? I'm a libertarian, okay? I'm like Nozick, whatever, right? So discredit me if you want. These thinkers that we're talking about, they're not that type of libertarian. That's not where they're coming from, okay? Their definition of a free society is a society of the citizens' own choosing. So it's a much older, like, sort of Republican notion, right, that they're trying to develop. Free society is a society of your own choosing. So that means you're stuck with a fundamental puzzle right from the start, which is, right, Rousseau's question in Choosing in Groups, which is, how can an individual be free while subject to wills other than their own? All right, now get ready. Rousseau pulls the rabbit out of the hat like a little trick, general will, right? All right, and all of these thinkers are like, no rabbits there. There's no procedure to get to the general will, but yet we still must choose in groups. So how can we still be free while subject to wills other than your own? That explains their puzzles and paradoxes and everything and their different answers. So Hayek has his answers about the rule of law. Buchanan has his answers about the Constitution. Eleanor Ostrom has her answers about how it is that you solve self-governing communities through various different community rules that allow us to have constitutions from the bottom up. The biggest difference between Buchanan and Ostrom versus Hayek is that Ostrom and Buchanan are committed to Hamilton's line in Federalist 1, which is, are our constitutions going to be a product of accident and force or of choice and reflection? And those, they both agree that a constitution is important, but what they want to do is they want to have it be choice and reflection and choice. It's just that they do the reflection and choice at a different level. Buchanan does the exercise behind a veil of ignorance, or a variety of different things, where he's going to have this reflective equilibrium, and it's going to be done from on top. Whereas Eleanor is actually doing that constitution making in the wild, right? So it's in the ground doing that. A lot of us, by the way, who again want to stretch spontaneous order explanations as far as we think they can go, that's part of the reason why we find that Eleanor is pushing the agenda farther than what we had with Hayek and Buchanan. And so we see this, again, this evolution. But Eleanor is not possible unless you have the adjacent made possible by, Buchanan and Hayek. If you go to my Facebook page, the picture is Eleanor at an event that I put together for Buchanan, and she's holding up her copy of the Calculus of Consent. All right? Now, remember, this is just like a joke here, right, that she's going to about do. So don't take it too seriously. We had a student one time take this like seriously, as if we're like theologists. But she said, Jim, this was our Bible. Okay, now she didn't mean like that was our faithful Bible. She just meant that's the starting point for where we go with everything like that. So when you think about this issue of the general will and all of that, don't worry, I'm not checking my thing. I'm looking up the photo that I had. I'm weird, so I keep books on my phone, and then I take photos of them so that I can read the passages to you. But this is the key thing. So if there is no such thing as a general will, you can't have monocentric explanations, right? And so what is Eleanor's main problem? This is from Governing the Commons, page 215, okay? I don't have a photographic memory, so I have photographs, okay? AI helping me. The intellectual trap in relying entirely on models to provide the foundation for policy analysis is that scholars then presume they are omniscient observers able to comprehend the essential details of how complex dynamic systems work by creating stylized descriptions of some aspect of those systems. With the false confidence of presumed omniscience, scholars feel perfectly comfortable in addressing proposals to government, right? And note what I said, to government, right? That are conceived in the models of omnicompetent powers, also able to rectify the imperfections that exist in all field settings. In contemporary conception of social order, the government often is seen as an external agent whose behavior is exogenous to the situation being modeled. Okay? Then she quotes a guy named Sugden, and right, he says, most modern economic theories describe a world presided over by government, not significantly by governments. So note the polycentricism that Eleanor is trying to get us to think about there. That's the idea. Governments, various different decision nodes, all in contestation with one another. Not a single boss, right, that could take over. By the way, also notice in that passage, she's invoking what? What Hayek would later call the fatal conceit. Right? It's the fatal conceit, the presumed knowledge that you know how to construct things. All right, I got just a few more, and then I'll finish. So this is more. So I'd already mentioned libertarian. Now I'm going to piss off the quantitative political scientists and economists. So I think this of the landscape of social science theories, right? What you have is theory and empirics. And what we really like because of parsimony is thin theory with clean empirics. Right? I have a colleague in the economics department, when students go to meet him for their dissertation, he says to them, what would you say if you had your ideal data set? Now let's go from there, right? Another type is, this is the stuff that's a little, so that can be contrasted with thick theory and dirty empirics. That's like anthropology, but also history. But then you have this other thing, which is that you have a thick theory, right? And then you have like empirics. Those are like those papers in which, and then we find the R square fits. Is everyone following me? Like lots of lines, and then we say, oh, look, we got an R square, right? I hate that stuff. Anyway, but then you have this other box here. That is that you have the sort of thin theory, that parsimonious theory that economics gives us, but you throw it into the environment of trying to understand the wild. Right? He's trying to understand the issues of the wild. And so to me, this is, you can do qualitative work that does not get dismissed by those persuaded by the quantitative methods. That's the goal. going back to the issue having to do with Polanyi, right? You don't want to get dismissed. And it's important to discuss the reasons why you are pursuing the project the way you are, why you're choosing to do that, why you're not cherry picking. So you still have to meet those same kind of tests. Eleanor Ostrom didn't cherry pick her examples. She gives you examples of success, gives you examples of failure, and gives you examples of those in the mix that are in the process of either being fragile or whatever, right? And so by doing that, she's able to address the issue. Now, also the thing is, when she picks her success, the ones that she picks are the ones that are least likely to have succeeded. That's why common pool is being used. It's the one example in which self-governance should be the least likely to emerge, yet nevertheless it does. So we want to engage in a methodology of process tracing and multiple methods methodology. I personally think that one of the most fruitful areas would actually be economic ethnography. So you know how anthropologists go and live like in an environment and do, tell these stories? Imagine if an economist did that. I'm talking economics now, right? Or economists did social history. So just to give you some examples, Emma Griffin, who was at one time the president of the Royal Academy, whatever it is, over in Britain, history wing, she wrote this fantastic book called Liberty's Dawn. It's about the history of the 19th century and Industrial Revolution and the improvement. Remember what I said before, right? The oppression and then the deliverance. And what she did was she outlined the deliverance that the Industrial Revolution gave to the working class in terms of life expectancy, per capita income, all those kind of things like that. She took a lot of crap for that book, okay? So she wrote a follow-up book focusing on those who didn't escape. And they didn't escape because of bad actors, and that's called breadwinners. And she asked the question, what happens because of the restrictions on women's rights that Jamie laid out? What happened when women were abandoned by their deadbeat husbands, right? They just up and left, right? And then what happened to them? She wrote a whole book about that. But again, the key issue is she dug down into the lives of individuals on the ground and told their economic story. I want social scientists to be doing work like that. I want to see more of it. And people don't want to see it. Not in social science. In the humanities, they're all happy with it. Okay? They don't want to see it. So I think in my capacity as a book editor, in my capacity as a journal editor, those are works I want to highlight and platform. Viviana Zelizer, she has a fantastic book called Economic Lives. And let me give you one other thing, which is and again, this is why it's weird. Emma Griffin is the top of the history professor in England, okay? Viviana Zelizer is the top economic sociologist. They have an award named after her, and she's still alive. So the American Sociological Association gives an award in her name, okay? Francesca Trivolati, the next name I'm going to mention, she's a professor, the Mellon professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, which, by the way, for all the stuff I was saying about teaching before, the golden ring of a job in academics is the Institute for Advanced Study or All Souls College in Oxford. If you could land those, life would be very good for you, okay? Francesca Trivolati has that. She has this fantastic book called The Familiarity of Strangers, which is basically how trade spread throughout Middle Ages, okay? And in particular, how trade spread led by Jews who were in fact despised and persecuted and all that stuff. So it's an amazing work, and we should actually be digging into works like that, okay, rather than these other things. That's what I want to push. But you got to do it through an analytical narrative lens. So these theories, what characterizes these works? It's theories of self-governance. And this is in particular our group here. All right, we focused a lot on that. I started by studying, as I mentioned, the Soviet economy. Paul and I, work in that area of Soviet and post-Soviet or post-communist studies. We used to have a project which bled into development economics, which studied the process of post-communist sort of development of markets that we had at one time. We had teams of researchers in all various different geographic parts of the world exploring this idea. John has been mentioning the Doing Business Index. Before that, there was this project by USAID called the Investors Roadmap, which the Doing Business Index Jankoff took from and then built further from for the World Bank.
But the idea was the simplest idea was how many days did it take to start up a business, right, in your country, and what are the impediments to entrepreneurship in the country. And we studied those things from Africa to China, to be honest with you. And we had people in all those areas looking at that stuff. But our biggest one probably was not only post-war, which Chris Coyne has addressed in a fantastic book called After War, but post-war reconstruction, but also post-crisis reconstruction. Crises come in the form of man-made, wars, and nature. That is hurricanes, earthquakes, things like that. But where do we draw like our kind of inspiration from? John Stuart Mill. In John Stuart Mill's Principles of Economics, Political Economy, he actually has a passage where he says one of the great mysteries is how fast countries can rebound from war, from fires, from various different disasters. And his argument is basically like that can happen for if you allow two conditions, which is the free mobility of labor and the free mobility of capital. All right, so we have a whole series of studies that tried to look at the political, legal, and social aspects that political and legal, social and cultural and economic and financial aspects of the post-Katrina and then other things. Virgil Storr has been a major researcher of that, Emily Chamley Wright. Stephanie Hafley's been a major person. She did a lot of work on recovery after Superstorm Sandy. And, they've examined this issue of how it is that if you take a society, tear it apart by either a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, how do you reconstitute it? Right? Now, again, that's not a problem of stasis. That's a problem of change. That's the larva turning into a butterfly. Right? Not just what's the optimality of the butterfly. What are the conditions of the larva? It's like that very process of changing. That requires different type of science. And that's what our various people have been working on as applied research. So lessons learned in this history. One, curiosity is better than cleverness. A lot of social science disciplines and philosophy choose on cleverness, mainly economics and analytic philosophy. Quickness and cleverness, right? Those are like judging. I'm not saying be dull and whatnot, but I would argue that curiosity is much better than cleverness. Allow yourself to see the mystery of the universe and then want to uncrack it, or crack it open. Persistence pays off, so to work hard, try to pursue. Ideas, not people, so you focus on critical engagement. You harshly criticize one another, and then you go have a beer with one another. You want to know how messed up our conversation is at the moment? Keep this in mind as a pedagogical tool. So there's a group called the John Locke Societies. Anyone here from Europe at all? Right? So in England, they take this thing called a gap year, at least the elite do. And these are all kids that are going to Oxford, Cambridge, or LSE, okay? And they take a gap year, but their gap year is spent in the United States traveling and seeing various different things. And I usually get to lecture to them once, when they come through the Washington, D.C. area. And 2 years ago, I'm talking to them, and after I get done with my talk, I'm waiting for them to ask me like real questions. And they say, "Professor, can you give us some advice? This has been hell. This trip has been hell for us." I'm like, "Okay." He says, and I'm just going to make up the names now. You have, Harry and I don't know, what's the one that's going to be king? What's his name? William. Okay, so you have Harry and William, and it turns out that Harry is like this hardcore like libertarian anarchist, and William is like a Bernie Sanders type socialist. Okay. And the kids say every night we come back from having our little visits with people and they fight with each other all night long and just scream at each other. And it makes it really terrible and uncomfortable for the rest of us. And so we go to bed, we're terrible, and we wake up next day and then we're like, oh, it's going to happen all over again. And so I look at Harry and William and I say, so Harry, you're a libertarian, huh? He says, yeah. I said, well, tonight, when you go home, I want you to take the position as best that you can understand of what you think William would believe. And William, I want you to take Harry's position and then do that. Okay, now, the The rest of the summer, I kept on getting emails from these kids telling me how happy they were that I told them to do that. Now, what's fascinating to me is that the professor in charge of supervising them never thought of that. That no teacher in their history prior to that had ever made them do that exercise. Okay? So that seems weird to me because that seems like the most obvious thing. Go back to Paul's point about modus vivendi, right? We need to have respect and toleration and recognize the dignities of those who disagree with the arguments that we have. So disagree very vehemently. Economics, everyone likes to bitch about the economic culture. Economic culture is actually great. It's like great fun. We rip each other apart. It's like, can I survive this? If you could survive it, it's awesome, right? It's very rare that you can survive it. I used to make a distance. I was at NYU. I'd say on the East Coast, right, what they want to do is they think time is money. So they want to destroy you as fast as possible. On the West Coast, okay, they're like, oh, it's cool. Like we're all like laid back or whatever. And so they would wait an hour until they tried to destroy you, okay? But that's like it's kind of the difference in those two cultures. I don't think that that's the problem. I don't think that's toxic or anything like that. What would be toxic is if you had that and then you couldn't go have a beer with the person, right? If the argument was not, oh, your ideas are wrong, but they looked at me and they said, you're fat, right? Then I'd be like, that's kind of toxic, right? But if they tell me, you believe in the power of the market, and I think they're not taking into account like externalities or whatever, I'm like, okay, now we can have a conversation, right? And so, if it's ideas, not people, and you focus on that, critical engagement, that's healthy. Thinking without writing is daydreaming, so get it down, get it out. Academic activism is not policy activism. Pursue ideas wherever they may lead, not concerned with the day-to-day. Just do the ideas, right? And then finally, and this seems maybe at odds, but it's not, which is relevance is a virtue, not a vice. Work can be deployed to address problems in the world today, but it's not about activism. It's about being relevant to the conversation, which are different. All right, so research is highly personal. I can't tell you what to research on. That's up to you. I can't tell you whether or not your approach is actually the wrong approach or right approach. I can tell whether or not you're coherent or incoherent, but I can't really direct you in everything you do. So instead, that's got to be up to you. So you guys are graduate students. If you're not at your dissertation stage, simply be promiscuous intellectually. Be open to every kind of field and possibility, not field, but field in your discipline, right? That can teach you. You want to, once you fall in love, let's say you get to your dissertation, then what you want to do is you want to pursue that doggedly, but never dogmatically, right? So the final thing is just, again, on this curiosity thing, remember, in doing social science, don't be literature constrained, but focus on looking out the window, right? We're trying in the end to understand the human condition. That's what we're trying to do. So therefore, pay attention to the human condition, not to the condition in the APSR or the AER. All right, so final thing, summing up of what I said. Understand the Republic of Science and the sociology of philosophy. You're about to enter that world. So if you don't understand that world, you're going to get hit on the side of your head, right? So understand what's going on. Here's a big one. Don't be inept and don't be lazy. Every one of you should go and listen to Roger Federer's commencement address at Dartmouth, right? Because he took on the idea of effortlessness. And he explained how much work is implied in appearing to be effortless, right? So don't be inept, don't be lazy. Find friends who will identify the weaknesses in your arguments. That's a key thing. Not friends who will cheer you on. Good job, Sonny, right? While you're falling or whatever. So don't be Joe Biden. Right? Good job, Joey. What the hell? The whole world just saw he didn't do a good job. So why say you answered every question right? So, find friends that will say to you, hey, man, I don't know, drink some coffee or something. All right. Be a productive member of your department, not a lunch tax. And then dare to be different. You work with good people, pay attention to details. I know that this is too editorializing at the moment, but the greatest thing that has ever happened to me, I'm an extremely fortunate academic. I very unique in that regard, actually. I get to work with people who were my graduate students, which is very unfortunate. I mean, not unfortunate. I just had a Biden moment. Vice President Trump. So I apologize. I'm extremely fortunate because it's very rare that you get a chance to do that. All right, so when students finish their PhDs, they normally go away and then they're away forever. In my particular case, I've had a unique fortune of having people who worked with me as graduate students and then went away and then were able to come back and work with me. And I am just so fortunate for that because I have this like long relationship with these people. And here's the thing about it. They're all extremely talented and extremely good. They make me 10 times better than I ever could have been on my own. And I'm very cognizant of that. Like, I realize my own weaknesses and everything as a scholar and as a teacher and as a citizen. And the fact that I work with people that are constantly making me a better scholar, me a better teacher, I'm just elated for that. And so work with good people. You might not be fortunate like I have to work with people, the same people for so many stages of their life and whatnot, but you have people where you're at, wherever you're going to end up. You're going to have people there that can be very, very helpful, and work with them and avoid working with the people that are bad. Right? And again, go back to your idea. Who would be a good co-author? You all go back to elementary school. You did joint projects, right? Who were the kids you didn't want in the joint project? Right? Don't work with them as co-author. It's really simple. You learned it in kindergarten, right? That kid shirks. You didn't call it that then. Like, he does nothing. That's the same thing, right? So you don't work with that person. You work with the person that tries to elevate you. And then the final thing is a weird thing, but it's actually, you really got to pay attention to details. Details matter. The way you cite people, the way you do all those things. Like when you write a paper, make sure that paper looks like the papers that are in that journal. Okay? When you put a CV online, don't watch Legally Blonde first, right? Put like perfume on it and pink or whatever and think that's going to work, all right? What you need to do is you need to actually go and take the top person in your field. Who is the very best person in the field? What does their public persona look like? I'm going to make my public persona look like that. Again, it isn't rocket science. It's literally that. So pay attention to detail and just really enjoy the whole process. I know I've talked way too long. I would normally apologize, but I'm not going to. But we have some time for questions, and I'd be really glad to try to answer your questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.